Step into the damp, suffocating darkness of a Roman dungeon, where the air smells of iron and old fear. You see, history has a way of sanitizing the screams of the past until they're nothing but dry ink on a page. We often think of the Roman Empire as the absolute peak of civilization, all marble pillars and grand laws. But for a small group of outcasts, it was a meat grinder designed to crush the soul long before it killed the body. This isn't a triumphant saint standing in golden light. No, this is a visceral descent into a world where your neighbor was your executioner, and your faith was a death warrant signed in your own blood. In the year 64, the city of Rome didn't just burn, it transformed into a furnace of paranoia. The Emperor Nero needed a scapegoat, and he found one in a sect so small they were barely a footnote in the records. These were the early Christians. Their suffering wasn't a quick end. It was a slow, systematic erasure of their humanity that started long before they ever stepped foot into the arena. The Roman world was built on the concept of pax deorum, the peace of the gods. It was the belief that every sacrifice and every ritual kept the sun rising and the borders secure. So when the Christians refused to burn incense to the emperor, they weren't just seen as religious rebels, they were viewed as cosmic terrorists. Their stubbornness in the Roman mind invited earthquakes and plagues upon the innocent. Imagine the isolation of walking through a marketplace where every single stall required a nod to a pagan deity. Every social gathering ended in a libation you simply could not perform. You become a ghost in your own city, watching your friends turn their backs and hearing the whispers, the rumors that you eat the flesh of children in your secret midnight meetings. The Roman public didn't just hate Christians, they feared them with a primal, gut-wrenching terror that demanded blood as the only possible cure for their anxiety.
Nero took that public fear and turned it into an art form of cruelty. It's a level of depravity that still haunts the historical record. He didn't just execute these men and women, he turned their agony into a public spectacle for citizens to watch while they ate their dinner. He covered human beings in pitch and oil, setting them ablaze to serve as living torches for his garden parties. To him, a simple execution wasn't enough to satisfy the Roman thirst for order. We talk about the martyrs, but we rarely talk about the psychological breaking point, like a mother watching her child be led toward a cage of starving leopards while the crowd roars for more. These were ordinary people, carpenters, slaves, and weavers who were forced to decide every single second if their invisible God was worth their very visible tearing of their flesh. The tension in Rome was a living thing that squeezed the breath out of the faithful, because betrayal could come from anywhere. A disgruntled slave or a jealous business rival could whisper a single word to a magistrate, and suddenly your entire family was being dragged into the street in chains. There was no due process here. There was no mercy for those who followed a dead man on a cross. To the Roman mind, the cross was the ultimate symbol of failure and shame. To follow a crucified leader was to admit you were the lowest of the low, and the empire was determined to prove that your God was just as helpless as you were.
But as the fires burned and the lions paced the sand, something strange began to happen in the hearts of the watchers, something the Roman authorities never anticipated. Every time a Christian died with a prayer on their lips instead of a plea for mercy, the crowd felt a flicker of something that wasn't just bloodlust. They saw a level of conviction that made their grand temples and golden statues look hollow and fragile by comparison. The suffering was immense and the losses were total, but the more the empire tried to bury them, the more the seed of this new movement began to crack the very foundation of the Roman soul. You have to understand, this wasn't a fair fight. It was an ant standing against a mountain, and yet the mountain was starting to tremble. The darkness of the dungeons was absolute, but the stories emerging from those pits were beginning to travel further than the Roman legions ever could. The Roman Empire was not a clumsy giant. It was a master of administrative cruelty. Once the state decided you were a cancer, it applied the scalpel with terrifying precision. By the 2nd and 3rd centuries, the persecution of Christians shifted from the chaotic outbursts of Nero to the cold, legalistic machinery of emperors like Decius and Diocletian. This was a sophisticated war on the psyche. The goal wasn't just to kill the body, but to force a soul to break under the weight of its own survival instinct. The authorities realized that making a martyr only inspired others, so they turned to a much darker weapon, the libellus. This was a formal certificate proving you had sacrificed to the Roman gods. Without it, you were a social pariah, a legal ghost, and a target for the state's most creative tormentors. Imagine the internal wreckage of a father standing before a stone altar with a handful of incense in his palm. He knows that if he just drops those grains onto the fire, his children will live to see the sunset. The Romans didn't always want your life, they wanted your betrayal. A living traitor was far more useful to the empire than a dead hero. They would strip you of your property, seize your home, and leave your family to starve in the gutters, all while whispering that the pain could end with a single, simple gesture of worship. This was a psychological meat grinder that turned families against themselves. Some chose the safety of the incense, while others chose the silence of the cell. The suffering wasn't just in the iron and the fire, it was in the crushing guilt of those who watched their brothers and sisters go to the lions, while they held their signed certificates in trembling hands. As the legal pressure intensified, the locations of Christian life moved deeper into the shadows. We've all heard of the catacombs, those vast networks of tunnels carved into the volcanic rock beneath Rome, but the reality was far from a romantic hideout. These were damp, cramped burial chambers, the living huddled among the rotting remains of their predecessors, breathing the air of the dead while they prayed for the strength to join them. In these narrow corridors, the smell of damp earth and decomposing flesh became the scent of the faith, a constant reminder that for a Christian, the next world was far more real than the one trying to kill them.
The Roman torture chambers were essentially rooms of scientific exploration into the limits of human endurance. They were designed to keep a person on the brink of death for as long as possible. They used the rack to pull joints from their sockets, iron combs to scrape skin from bone, and the gridiron to slow roast the faithful over low coals. The Roman officials would often sit and watch, calmly taking notes, asking the victim over and over again why they wouldn't just say the words and go home. They couldn't understand a logic that prioritized a hidden kingdom over the physical reality of a red-hot iron pressed against the ribs. This disconnect created a strange, eerie atmosphere in the courts. The judges grew increasingly frustrated by the obstinacy of the accused, who often thanked their executioners for the opportunity to suffer. But the most effective tool of the empire wasn't the pain itself, it was the public shame. In the Roman honor-shame culture, being stripped naked and paraded through the streets was a fate worse than death. Women of noble birth were thrown into brothels to be used by the lowest dregs of society, their dignity weaponized against their faith in a desperate attempt to prove that their God could not protect them. The empire wanted to strip away the specialness of the Christians, to show the world they were just broken, humiliated animals. Yet, in those moments of ultimate degradation, a new kind of power was being forged. It was a resilience that didn't rely on status, wealth, or even physical safety. The more the empire tried to shame them, the more the Christians found glory in the dirt, turning the symbols of Roman power into the background noise of a much larger story. The tension was reaching a boiling point because the Roman system was beginning to realize it was losing. You can kill a person, but it is much harder to kill a memory, and even harder to kill an idea that thrives on the very blood you spill to stop it. The governors began to write letters to the emperor, asking for guidance because their prisons were overflowing and their executioners were exhausted. The Roman world was built on the idea that might makes right, but they were facing a group of people who believed that weakness was strength.
This was the ultimate clash of civilizations, and as the 3rd century drew to a close, the empire decided to launch its final, most brutal attempt at total annihilation.
The year was 303, and the Roman Empire decided it was finally time for the Great Persecution. Emperor Diocletian didn't just want to punish Christians, he wanted to delete them from the face of the earth. He ordered every church leveled to the ground, every sacred text burned, and every Christian in high office stripped of their rank. This wasn't just a local riot, it was a state-sponsored purge that reached from the fog of Britain to the sands of Egypt. The empire became a giant trap where the only exit was apostasy or the grave. They targeted the leaders, the bishops, and the teachers, believing that if they cut off the head, the body would wither and die. But they fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the fire they were trying to extinguish. You cannot kill an idea by burning the person who holds it. The suffering reached a level of depravity that almost defies modern comprehension. In the arenas of Carthage and the squares of Lyons, the executions became increasingly theatrical. There are accounts of Christians being sewn into the skins of wild animals so that hunting dogs would tear them apart, or being forced to sit in red-hot iron chairs until the smell of roasting flesh filled the air. But as the bodies piled up, the Roman public began to experience a profound psychological shift. They started seeing the damnatio ad bestias, death by wild beasts, not as a victory for the law, but as a senseless slaughter of the innocent. They watched young girls like Blandina and Perpetua face the horns of bulls and the teeth of lions with a calm, supernatural dignity that made the powerful Roman magistrates look like trembling cowards. This was the moment the Roman soul finally cracked. The average citizen who had spent their life fearing the gods and the government looked into the eyes of the dying Christians and saw a freedom they didn't possess. They saw a community that looked after its poor, buried its dead with honor, and refused to hate those who were killing them. The blood of the martyrs, as the early writer Tertullian famously said, was becoming the seed of the church. For every Christian the empire executed, 10 more seemed to arise from the crowd, moved by the sheer audacity of a faith that could stare down the greatest power on earth and smile. The state's machinery of death was working at maximum capacity, but it was producing the opposite of the intended result. It was proving that the Roman gods were dead, and the Christian God was very much alive in the hearts of the broken. The end came not with a bang, but with a total systemic collapse of the Roman will to persecute. By the time Constantine marched toward the Milvian Bridge in 312, the empire was exhausted by its own cruelty. The policy of annihilation had failed so spectacularly that the government had no choice but to pivot. With the Edict of Milan, the chains were finally broken. The people who had lived in the sewers and the shadows stepped out into the blinding light of the sun. But the scars remained. The church that emerged from the era of blood was not the same one that entered it. It was a body forged in the furnace, hardened by the rack, and defined by the memory of those who had vanished into the lions' dens. The true legacy of the early Christians isn't found in the grand cathedrals that were eventually built, but in the silence of the dungeons where they waited for the end. They proved that human conviction, when anchored in something eternal, is the only force capable of dismantling an empire. They didn't win by fighting back with swords. They won by refusing to blink when the sword was at their throats. The Roman Empire, with all its legions, its gold, and its roads, eventually crumbled into dust and became a memory. But the faith that they tried to drown in blood survived to reshape the very world that had tried to destroy it. The story of the early Christians is the ultimate reminder that even in the deepest darkness of the Roman night, the human spirit can find a light that no fire can burn and no emperor can extinguish.